Welcome to the Sirius report. This is obviously Paul from the Sirius report. And once again, we're going to return to the subject of Ukraine and provide another briefing. Now, clearly, with the end of the Biden administration, this was always an opportunity, setting aside the political kind of landscape that exists in the United States, to find a way to get out of the Ukraine war. We've talked about that previously, how the United States wants to find a way out of it, but that's going to be extremely difficult to do so without losing enormous geopolitical face and also creating problems domestically. Now, there is an expectation that Trump and Putin will hold talks in the coming days. I think that will probably almost certainly be after the inauguration. The US Congressman Mike Waltz, who's supposed to be the incoming US National Security Advisor, has said comments that the war has become a World War I style meat grinder of people and resources. I would absolutely agree with that. He said with World War III consequences, well, I don't agree with that. I've always said this is not going to lead to World War III, but this is for American consumption on US television. And maybe words like that are wise to be said to the American people. He said everyone knows that this has to end somehow diplomatically. Yes. In the end, it's the only way the war's going to end, because as things stand, there is no other option to do so. He says, I just don't think it's realistic to say we're going to expel every Russian from every inch of Ukrainian soil, even Crimea. President Trump has acknowledged that reality. And I think it's been a huge step forward that the entire world, is acknowledging that reality. Now let's move forward. Now, when Waltz says the entire world, he's talking about the Western world. They're not interested in what Global South thinks about anything. So this is an acknowledgement that in terms of NATO countries, they'll publicly say many things. Privately, they'll say many things very, very differently. And in terms of saying we're not going to expel every Russian from every inch of Ukrainian soil, what he's basically acknowledging is that Russia will keep Donbass, will keep Zaporozhye and Kherson and Crimea. And from the United States' perspective, as things stand, they can't hope for any better outcome. The risk is the longer the war goes on, places like Dnipro, possibly Kharkiv, Sumy, maybe of course even Nikolaev and Odessa end up becoming Russian territory. As things stand, that is less likely to happen if the war ends sooner. Also, what was interesting is when talking about contacts between Trump and Putin, Waltz said, we can expect this phone call. That would be a first step, and then we'll take it from there. Well, yes, a lot depends on what Trump says to Putin, but I think the idea, again, worth repeating, that Zelensky thinks that Putin's afraid of Trump is nonsense. Putin's made his position very clear, and we'll come on to reiterating what those points are shortly. What's very interesting from Russia's perspective, if we flip the other side of this equation, is they're saying, look, Trump's offered nothing interesting for Russia to consider in terms of proposals on settling the Ukraine conflict. And it was back sort of mid-December-ish that Putin once again clearly outlined the Russian perspective, what those conditions were, on which they were ready to talk about not freezing, but ending the conflict, given the observance, of course, from the Russian perspective of what they believe are their legitimate security concerns. They've also ridiculed statements that have come out from the Ukrainian side saying, look, whatever they perceive is going to happen, we can't take it seriously and we're not going to do so. Of course, Russia has reiterated the point again, look, the engagement line will continue to look differently and it will change, with regards to Zelensky's perspective, when eventually he has to show some desire to sit down at the negotiating table. The longer that carries on, the worse the conditions will be for him. He was told this clearly a very long time ago. So it's up to him to decide when he wants to do that. I mean, of course, how much pressure the United States decides to put on him is an entirely different question. But it is true, the longer the war goes on, that engagement line is going to continue to move. And there's no doubt Russia is now extremely close to Dnipro. There is no defences there whatsoever. So Russia could very quickly move through Dnipro and then say, right, this is now part of Russia, for argument's sake. So these are things that will be factoring into the Trump administration's thinking. Trump himself, and of course, when he has discussions with, obviously, Putin at some point in the future. Now, it's worth noting the following. If you go back to mid-June last year, Putin basically outlined the conditions for resolving the war in Ukraine, where his terms included Ukraine needs to withdraw its troops from Donbass, from Novorossiya, and abandon any plans or any idea of any plans to join NATO. All Western sanctions must be lifted, and Ukraine's non-bloc and non-nuclear status must be guaranteed, whilst Ukraine must ensure the rights, freedoms, and interests of all Russian-speaking citizens inside Ukraine. There has been some speculation that Putin also wanted the rolling back of NATO to 1991 borders. That remains to be seen whether that's even remotely realistic or it will even happen. But as a basis, it's very simple, and demilitarizing, obviously, Ukraine in the process. And in no way, shape or form it will pose a threat to Russia in the future. The one thing I think increasingly, at least, the Ukrainians are now beginning to realize the idea of retaking the territories in the east of the country in the future is just not realistic. It's not going to happen. Because there's no doubt about it, Ukraine is suffering hugely along all sections of the front line. It lacks any experienced soldiers. It doesn't have the military aid and military equipment. And the levels at which it's been able to replenish that stock is diminishing rapidly. And really, effectively now, Kiev's situation is such that it wants to try and hold the territory it currently believes it controls. And that's been a statement where they want to try and stabilize the front line. Well, they're not going to stabilize the front line. That's absolutely clear because the front line's crumbling rapidly. It wants to somehow strengthen its defensive capabilities. Well, it can't do because its ability to do that is diminishing. But there's no doubt, as things stand, the idea of being able to rectify the major differences in the positions of Russia and Ukraine is a huge problem. There's certainly uncertainty about what Trump's going to do. He says, I want to end the war in 24 hours. Well, saying something to get elected or partly get elected, but then to actually be elected and then have to implement policy decisions are very different in reality. Now it's worth coming on to some operational aspects to do with the war. It's very interesting that Russia's recently downed a number of drones that tried to attack part of the infrastructure of the Turkstream gas pipeline on Russian territory. It was aimed at a compressor station in the Krasnodar region in southern Russia. The facility's working normally. There were no casualties. They didn't really create any damage. Now, Turkstream and obviously Blue Stream, which run under the Black Sea to Turkey, are effectively the last routes along which Russia provides pipeline gas to Europe, because as we know at the start of the year, Ukraine refused to renew the transit deal that would allow Russia to keep pumping gas across its territory. Now, the Russian statement regarding this attack in Krasnodar was they caused some minor damage, a drone to a building, and the equipment of this gas metering station at the compressor. Now, compressor stations actually stabilise the pressure and flow rate of gas. So, of course, these kind of attacks will continue. There's no doubt about it. And the motivation for doing this from the Ukrainians' perspective is to try and prevent Russia exporting any gas to anyone because they think it's going to cripple Russia. Well, in the end, of course, it won't cripple Russia. It will cripple Europe even more than it already is because of the destruction of Nord Stream, and also, of course, the cessation of gas going across from Ukraine heading east to west. Another point worth making is Chazov Yar. That is a hugely strategical position in Ukraine. Now, the liberation of that is going to help Russian forces take over the significant dominant height position over remaining large towns in Donetsk, still controlled by, of course, the Ukrainians, and it will seriously disrupt the logistics of the Ukrainian army in the process. Now, really, it's just increasingly a matter of time before Russia takes control fully of that region. And really, they're then reaching the point then where then Russia can take the remaining towns of the Donbass region, which is Kramatorsk and Konstantinovka. Once they're gone, really effectively, to all intents and purposes, Russia would take all of the remaining Donbass rather easily. The other thing from Ukraine's position in this region, they're being rapidly encircled. When the efforts were made by the Ukrainians to act as reinforcement, it came to nothing. I mean, Russia is certainly prevailing there in this critical region. They almost certainly will be victorious, and this will allow them then to expand the bridgehead and deliver a significant blow to Ukraine's logistics chain. I mean, the other thing, of course, that Russia's doing in regard to this is they're actually taking down types of Ukrainian drones using light arms. They have paratrooper units who've been very successful in doing this. Another critical region or critical town that's worth noting is Kharkiv. Now, that obviously was something that was strategically very important in Donetsk and was fortified over a decade ago. And they developed a lot of permanent firing positions, underground communications. Ukraine had amassed probably 15,000 troops in this town. It had elite units there. It also was present with foreign mercenaries. Now Russia has established control of Kharkiv in Donetsk, will obviously hinders the capability of providing support services to Ukrainian armed forces in this region. And I mean, it's an important logistics hub. And therefore, of course, it will affect Ukraine's ability to regroup militarily and their opportunity, of course, to use any artillery shells to target the city of Donetsk will have come to an end as a result of this. So you're starting to see in Donetsk, Russia taking key strategic towns and areas rapidly, which of course is then going to seriously underpin the discussion about ending the Ukraine war, because, as I said, Russia takes certain of these strategic areas they're going to, or towns, cities, settlements, then that's going to radically affect their ability to progress rapidly through Dnipro, etc., and other regions. Another point worth making, there's been a lot of statements, rightly, about the West buying up assets dirt cheap from the Ukrainians. Except, of course, as Russia makes progress, and one example of this is in Shevchenko, and Russia effectively has now gained control of this. Why is this important? Because now Russia controls an enormous lithium deposit that was previously sold to the West. And what's very telling is probably a year or so ago, the Ukrainians transferred the rights of the development of this Shevchenko lithium deposit to the West. Now, of course, that resource now belongs to the Russians. It'd be mined by the Russians, and Ukraine is never going to get it back. So this is another example along the war goes on. Russia is likely to gain more and more strategic assets, which in some cases, not all of them, Western interests own them. They're going to be furious because they've paid whatever price they paid to the Ukrainians, and they've now lost control of these assets. And from their perspective, they're worth the princely sum of nothing. Another one I want to make is some comments Medvedev made. And it was interesting when there has been some statements about trying to have some sort of, from the Western perspective, which of course is a bit meaningless, but it's of interest, has reported having some sort of German model for the future of Ukraine, meaning we're going to have a West Ukraine and an East Ukraine. And part of this is they think, under that basis, if there was a West Ukraine, then what that means is that could then be granted membership of NATO, which is never going to happen. There could be mutual defence guarantees, which would only apply to territory under Kiev's actual control, meaning West Ukraine. And of course, the idea from the West's perspective, because they're so delusional, is that, well, that's how it's going to be. I mean, but that would ultimately, therefore, still lead to the risk from the Russia's perspective that Ukraine would then have formal NATO accession. And of course, they think historically, well, we broke Germany up, but eventually East Germany reunified with West Germany. And in the future, politically, we'll engineer some scenario where that happens. And then it'll all be reabsorbed into one Ukraine, and Ukraine will be a nation state again, and Russia will be kicked out. And the idea that Russians can't see through this very transparent idea of a German model is frankly ludicrous. Now, Medvedev, who's the deputy chair of the Russian Security Council, commented on this, saying, this idea is one that's being floated ahead of Trump's inauguration. But as he said, Medvedev, he just dismissed the idea that this is going to happen, and somehow in the future then, East Ukraine will become part of Ukraine and they'll seize all these former regions. And he said, who would honestly consider a scenario in which a nuclear power would relinquish something to the nation state of Ukraine? It means they think that at some point this is going to be achievable because Russia will cease to exist as a nation, which is equally, of course, ludicrous. Medvedev rightly said attempts to draw parallels between the Ukraine conflict and what happened in Germany, obviously post-war, leading eventually to the breakup of Germany and then the reunification after the fall of the Berlin Wall. He said was nothing more than Kiev trying to placate elements inside its own country who are rapidly seeing the war ending. And they're trying to sell some idea that means, in the future, maybe 10 years, maybe 20 years, maybe 5 years down the line, Ukraine will then again be a nation state. Russia will be kicked out. But a lot of this is just delusional thinking in the West, who don't seem to understand the fact that if Ukraine is the victor in the war, and Russia's the victor in the war, then Russia's largely going to dictate the terms of the end of the war, because if the West doesn't agree to this, Russia can just carry on fighting the war for years to come, and the West is in no position to carry on with prosecuting this war and assisting Ukraine as they have done for nearly 3 years. So, in essence, I think this is the sort of developments that are more interesting in terms of understanding what's happening in Ukraine, rather than from our perspective, a lot of the day-to-day operational stuff isn't really that interesting, not going to change the outcome of the war, but there are certain key strategic towns, cities, regions that when they fall into Russian hands, that makes a big difference in when the war is going to end, and it's going to certainly influence the thinking inside the Trump administration and Trump himself. Now, remains to be seen when this phone call happens. There are a lot of claims that at some point Trump and Putin will meet, and presumably they think also with Zelensky. Well, that remains to be seen. But this is far more complicated than just this idea I can end the war, because if Trump tries to, and I'm not suggesting he will, bully the Russians into submission, it's not going to work. Russia will just keep the war going. And as I said, the longer it carries on, the worse the problem is for the West, the worse the problem is for the Ukrainians. So it's in their interest to look to end the war and to coin a phrase, avoid as much more damage as to their reputation, to the nation state of Ukraine, to the loss of lives of Ukrainian forces, and just simply accept the fact they've lost the war and just in essence, prevent any more meat grinders stop through their actions, resulting in huge, enormous loss of life of Ukrainian military personnel, and particularly the idea that they want to recruit 18-year-olds to fight the war. As we said previously, this is just outrageous. They have no capabilities to do so. They're not going to have any training, any equipment. And it's telling, of course, that Trump wants to end the war in 24 hours, but then says, well, I think you should be recruiting 18-year-olds. Now, there's a lot of stories going around about what this means, and Trump's playing 4D chess doing this. There's no evidence for that. Trump is doing this to try and put more, he thinks is putting more and more pressure on Russia by saying, well, the war will just carry on because they can recruit 18-year-olds and put them on the front line. And, potentially they could create another 500,000 fighting force, but you can't fight a war if you haven't got the equipment, the resources, and the capability to do so, and to have any formal training. Because, as I've said many times myself, if you put me on the front line in Ukraine with a week's training, I'll be lucky if I last a few hours. I would have absolutely no idea what I was doing. And the same will apply whether you're 18, 38, 58, or any other age that's been recruited, because there have been people as old as 60 being conscripted into the Ukrainian army. And with that, we end this podcast. Thank you very much, obviously, for all your ongoing support, which is greatly appreciated. Please like, share, subscribe, comment, and spread the word so we can help to grow the channel. And with that, I'll say goodbye.